Welcome to E-PG-Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on sociology in India. Today we are going to discuss the module Patterns of Exploitation, Social Exclusion and Subordination. This module has been written by S. Yogesh, Research Scholar, Department of Sociology, University of Delhi. In this module, we are going to discuss and conceptualize the whole idea of exploitation, subordination and social exclusion in India. While focusing on systems of stratification, we will also see how the intersections of caste, class and gender intersect in order to produce different forms of exploitation, subordination and social exclusion in India, with special focus on poverty and untouchability. Introduction. This picture shows two men, one sitting on top of the other. The man on the top is not merely sitting but holds a rope tied around the neck of the other man. This picture invokes sociologically relevant question. Why is this picture significant? It is not because of the visible description but because of the meaning and interpretations that one can draw from the view of this picture. That the act of a man riding on another man in this picture can be read as controlling, abusing, shaming, degrading, exploiting, subordinating, exclusion and many other such insensitive and human acts. This picture might seem just as dramatic or even a metaphoric representation of all the above. History shows us that at certain points of time, the picture was a reality for many sections of societies across the globe. For example, slavery and the experience of colonialism. With the changes that societies are going through in terms of social and political systems, this picture might not be a reality anymore. It stands as a symbolic representation of the existing exploitation, subordination and exclusion. This module titled Patterns of Exploitation, Subordination and Social Exclusion discusses the various aspects of exploitation, subordination and exclusion. The module aims at achieving three things: identifying the presence of exploitation, subordination and exclusion, sociologically situating all the three concepts, explaining the various forms of exploitation, subordination and exclusion. To begin with identification of the presence of something, it is utmost important. The question is, how do we do this? Taking the same picture as an example, if the picture is read merely as a man sitting on another man, then there is no exploitation. When we read it as a man riding on another man, it shows exploitation. The one who is riding can be read as upper class, upper caste, educated, urban living and the man, and the other person on the other hand could be a lower class, lower caste and uneducated, non-urban living man. The question is, why is this the case? And it can ever be vice versa. These questions may make exploitation, subordination and exclusion sociologically relevant. Sociological explanation introduces the language of power to class, caste and gender experiences. Considering power while discussing caste, class and gender will help us in understanding them not as independent entities but as existing in relation to other institutions of society such as marriage, education, workplace, family. Hence this module focuses on class, caste and gender as units or carriers of power, thus playing a role in causing exploitation, subordination and exclusion. Imagine the above picture with a man riding on a woman. For a while, can we imagine a woman riding on a man? Both the extremes denote the same exploitation, subordination and exclusion. The only difference is the former can be imagined and the latter is difficult to imagine. This leads to the final section of this module, the forms of exploitation. This section will also help us to achieve a better understanding of who an exploiter is and who is exploited, or who is with power and who is without power. How to locate exploitation, subordination and exclusion. The definition of exploitation, subordination and social exclusion explain the very basic meaning of this phenomenon. Now the need is to situate this definition in a context. Why is this important? It is important because if there is no context in which these definitions will rest, then how would we understand what exploitation is? Where is it happening? Why is it important to know about exploitation? The obvious context I would say is human society. Human society is not a simple entity but a complex phenomenon. It has a history of evolution of society, and hence I place this history of human society as a context in which we understand these processes. In sociology, it was a theorization of Karl Marx, who theorized on inequality and exploitation. The initial theorizations on society of Auguste Comte did not address the patterns of inequality, subordination that mark the relationships between people within society. Auguste Comte, Law of Three Stages. Auguste Comte was first to use the term sociology. He had developed a scientific view, positivism or positive philosophy, to combat what he referred to as negative and destructive philosophy of the Enlightenment. This new science, which in his view would ultimately become the dominant science, was to be concerned with both social statics existing social structures and social dynamics, social change. Comte did not urge revolutionary change because he felt that the natural evolution of society would make things better. This leads us to the cornerstone of Comte's approach, his evolutionary theory, or the law of three stages. The theory proposes that three intellectual stages through which the world has gone throughout its history. According to Comte, not only does the world go through this process, but also groups, societies, sciences, individuals, and even minds go through the same three stages, and so there is no possibility of conflict. The theological stage is the first stage and is characterized as a world prior to 1300. During this period, the major ideal system emphasized the belief that supernatural powers and religious figures modeled after humankind are the root of everything. The second stage is a metaphysical stage which occurred roughly between 1300 and 1800. This era was characterized by the belief that abstract forces like nature, rather than personalized God, explain virtually everything. Finally, in the 1800s, the world entered the positivistic stage characterized by belief in science. People now tended to give up the search for absolute causes, God or nature, and concentrated instead on observation of the social and the physical world in search for the laws governing them. Thus, evolutionary theory of Comte failed to realize the relationship between human beings in a society. The relationship of human beings with the material world was also negated. Considering these relationships, we understand that there is conflict in the human society, unlike the peaceful picture the law of three stages represent. Karl Marx helps us to understand this conflict and these relationships. Karl Marx, historical development. Marx's historical studies led him to argue that there has been a very long but structured historical development of human societies. In the ancient past, small-scale human groups existed with no developed system of property ownership. Instead, all the resources acquired were communally owned and no class divisions were present. Marx calls this a form of primitive communism. The production of these groups increased. This mode of production was effectively outgrown and a new mode emerged. Giddens argues this time saw some private property ownership, including slavery, such as in ancient Greece and Rome. From here, the societies developed based on settled agriculture and feudal property relations. The European system of feudalism was based on a class division between landowners and landless peasants and tenants, who were forced to work for the landowners in order to survive. But the feudal mode of production also reached its production limitations, and the system gave way to the capitalist society. Under capitalism, class antagonism were greatly simplified, with society splitting at two great camps: the property owners, capitalists, or the bourgeois, and the workers, or proletariat. Capitalism has been a genuinely revolutionary mode of production, but such achievements have been based on terrible exploitation of workers and consequently inevitable and endemic alienation amongst industrial workforce. Just like feudalism, Marx expected capitalism itself to give way to another mode of production, communism, brought about by disaffected workers who develop class consciousness and awareness of their exploited position, in which private property is abolished and communal social relations are established. The distinction between the two theories, as mentioned earlier, is the consideration of the relation between human beings and the material world. The stages of historical development by Marx introduces material world in terms of production. This analysis of the evolution of society helps us in understanding the basic cause for the existence of exploitation, subordination, and social exclusion. The historical developmental stages clearly illustrate the relationship between different people of the society. Here, going back to the figure, why is a particular man riding another particular man? What makes a man riding eligible to do so? Marx's contribution in understanding such questions is credited to the theory of alienation. Alienation is thus an important tool to understand any form of inequality, not only the class inequality and exploitation. Alienation. Marx called the distortions of human nature that are caused by the domination of the worker the alien will of capitalist alienation. Although it is the actor who feels alienated in a capitalist society, Marx's basic analytical concern was with the structures of capitalism because this causes alienation. It is a social structure that acts to break down the natural interconnections that characterize human nature in an ideal sense. Of crucial significance here is the two-class system in which the capitalists employ the workers and own the means of production, tools and raw materials. Components of alienation. Alienation can be seen as having four basic components. First, the workers in a capitalist society are alienated from the productive activity. The workers don't work for themselves, but they work for capitalists. Both workers and capitalists come to believe that the payment of a wage means that the productive activity belongs to the capitalist. Second, the workers are alienated not only from productive activities, but also from the object of those activities, the product. Just like the productive activity, the product belongs only to the capitalist and not for the worker. Third, the workers in capitalism are alienated from their fellow workers. The workers work in an instrumental way just for achieving profits for the capitalist. The capitalists are much interested in not the job satisfaction of the worker but the efficiency and the production. Hence, cooperation and coordination with fellow workers is not encouraged. Finally and most generally, the workers in a capitalist society are alienated from their own human potential. Consciousness is numbed and destroyed as relations with other humans and with nature are progressively severed. The result is a mass of people who are unable to express their essential human qualities, a mass of alienated workers. As I mentioned earlier, alienation, even though it is conceptualized based on the class distinction, it can be used to explain other differences. In this module, we will see this in detail. The nature of alienation being descriptive of the relationship between an individual and a form of society gives it its conceptual utility. Now going back to figure 1, if the two men were equal and equally powerful, the picture would have been different, probably standing next to each other or sitting next to each other. But it is not the case here, thus showing inequality. What does this mean? That inequality is only cause for exploitation, subordination and exclusion? Does it imply that inequality is prerequisite and there is no exploitation among equals? Surplus labor. Marx also argues that whenever workers provide surplus labor in the production process, labor for which they do not get equivalent remittances, they are exploited. He contended that in order to survive, workers work extra hours for other people and in companies, since the latter compel them to work as they have exclusive ownership over the means of production. Thus, while the exploited working class engages themselves in providing surplus labor, the exploiters, that is the capitalists, live off the profits generated by the workers in the course of production. Class antagonism rises when the workers want the exploitation to end, while the capitalist interest lies in perpetuating exploitation. Marx used his theory of surplus labor also to explain the generation of surplus value, profit. Surplus value arises when workers are coerced directly or indirectly to work longer hours than they are supposed to according to the wage contracts. This additional labor is not paid and therefore adds to profit making, and thus the magnitude of exploitation is directly related to the extortion of surplus labor and thus profit making. Unequal exchange theory. Unequal exchange theory was propounded by Emmanuel and is considered to be one of the most important theories on exploitation. Through this theory, he made an attempt to supplement and not replace Marxian understanding of exploitation. He contends that trade exports been comparatively lower earnings for less developed countries than the developed countries whose earnings are significantly higher. This leads to an hindrance of economic growth in developing countries while developed countries experience a rapid economic growth. Thus, being closely tied to the dependency theorists, the unequal exchange theory propagates the idea that underdevelopment of the third world is a dynamic condition resulting out of the unequal international wage rates and the tendency of the rates of profit to equalize. This module, even though does not all the questions, attempts to answer a few of them. To begin with, what is exploitation, subordination and social exclusion? Following is a conceptual explanation of these concepts. Exploitation, according to the Oxford Dictionary of Sociology, is a use for unacceptable purposes of an economic resource, be it land, labor or market position. Thus, a monopolist could use control of the market or charge consumers excessive prices, or an owner could utilize land in such a way as to damage the natural resources. In orthodox economics, the term has virtually no place. In Marxism, exploitation is central and is defined in terms of labor theory of value to denote the extraction of surplus value or difference between value of what a worker receives in wages and what is produced and appropriated by the capitalist. Exploitation will occur in all societies in which a minority controls the means of production, and all other words, all class societies. This is the basic cause of exploitation. According to Marx, a ruling class developed as soon as it became possible to produce more than that was needed for subsistence, that is, to produce a surplus. The ruling class is the class that controls the means of production. This controls enables them to force the producers to produce more than they receive. Controlling the means of production, including the producers, the ruling class also controls the life of the product of the surplus, unpaid and forced labor of the producers. The mode in which the surplus is extracted differs from one class society to another. Exploitation is not a phenomena that exists on its own. By this, the author means that exploitation has a history, has a meaning and has causes and results. For instance, in the first definition, used for unacceptable purposes of an economic resource, why is it an unacceptable purpose? Or sociologically relevant question is, when does a purpose become an unacceptable purpose? The second definition leads to the most important question that we'll be dealing in the coming sections. Minority controls the means of production. Who are these minorities? Who are these majority. Why and how does this relationship cause exploitation? Marxist literature shows an exploitative relationship between different economic classes, bourgeois and proletariat. Exploitation, even though largely dealt with in the Marxist literature, the concept has not been restricted to class-based exploitation. Every relation in society is recognized with the existence of power and thus exploitation in every relationship. For example, for many years, gender differences were argued and believed to be natural. But when it was recognized that there exists patriarchy which gives power to men, the exploitation was recognized. Subordination. According to George Simmel, the superior causes the inferior to produce a given effect which the superior shall experience. In this operation, in the case of subordination, is really absolute. No sort of spontaneity is present on the part of the subordinate. The reciprocal influence is rather the same as that between a man and a lifeless external object, with which the former performs an act for its own use. That is, the person acts upon the object in order that the latter may react upon him. In this, the reaction of the object, no spontaneity on part of the object is to be observed, but merely the further operation of the spontaneity of the person. Such an extreme case of superiority or inferiority will scarcely occur among human beings. Rather, will a certain measure of independence, a certain direction of the relation proceed also from the self, will and the character of the subordinate. The analogy that Simmel uses here is of a living human being and a non-living subject. The relationship between these two is explained. This analogy can be critiqued in numerous ways. Firstly, how far it is true that the object is not reciprocating to the actions on it. Going with the knowledge of economics, one would argue that the analogy misses the utility of an object. Secondly, the conclusion, such an extreme case of superiority and inferiority, will scarcely occur among human beings. Rather, will a certain measure of independence, a certain direction of the relation proceed also from the self-will and the character of the subordinate. This dilutes the existence of subordination among human societies. The author argues that it may lead to a serious loopholes in understanding the human societies. In the module, using the idea behind the analogy drawn to explain the existence of subordination, the idea is to show a non-egalitarian relationship between different human beings and thus the nature of this relationship. In doing so, the module will be discussing the nexus between class, caste and gender in perpetuating exploitation, subordination and social exclusion. In the following sections, these questions will be addressed. Social exclusion. The term itself implies on one hand groups of people who are in some sense marginalized from society, and on the other a societal mainstream composed of people who are not excluded. The range of excluded groups is very wide, extending from those subject to racism and to older people, and from those who are unemployed to those subject to homophobia, from those who are disabled to disillusioned youth, from the mentally ill to teenage mothers. There are perhaps inevitably an equally large number of definitions. Although most contain the common mainstream marginalization theme, the definition that perhaps best expresses the meaning of social exclusion was provided by the Child Poverty Action Group. Social exclusion refers to the dynamic process of being shut out fully or partially from any of the socio-economic, political, cultural systems which determine the social integration of people in the society. This definition gives a sense of being outsiders, unable to participate fully in society, and that the problem was systemic and that it involved whatever the cause system. As mentioned earlier, the basic question that has to be addressed while discussing concepts like exploitation, subordination and exclusion is who, why, when and where and how do these occur. Considering forms of exploitation, subordination and social exclusion is helpful in this regard. How do we do this? While understanding class, caste and gender question subordination, it seems like class, caste and gender function separately. Marx and Marxist scholars were critiqued for economic determinism. That is, class got overemphasized as the cause for existing exploitation in society, and these critiques are very well applicable to all the studies of caste, gender and even race. Most of the studies look at the subject matter, that is caste, class or gender, as isolated phenomenon. This module taking an intersectionality approach in order to understand how class, caste and gender do not function separate in specific compartments but function together. For example, if we are to sociologically analyze an incident of rape, how do we do it? Do we just consider the gender and sex of the person being raped and the person who has raped? If we do this, we'll reach at a problematic conclusion. A girl, woman, transgender, gay, lesbian was raped because of their gender. As I have mentioned earlier, such conclusions do not answer the question of power. Why does rape get perpetuated at all? Why is someone raped? Now, if we consider class, caste, gender, sexual orientation, biological sex of the individuals involved, the conclusions will be helpful in addressing such crucial questions. This method of analyzing that seeks to explore how structural inequality is layered is called intersectionality. Systems of stratification. The primary question we started with was, do exploitation, subordination and social exclusion exist? If yes, then why do they exist? We learned without understanding the history of society, it is not possible to identify exploitation, subordination and social exclusion. Karl Marx's explanation of historical development made us understand the context of society, which is not static and equal but dynamic and unequal. This leads us to the question is how was society unequal? Before understanding caste, class and gender based exploitation, subordination and social exclusion, we should understand caste, class and gender as systems of stratification. According to Anthony Giddens, sociologists use the concept of social stratification to describe inequalities that exist between individuals and groups within human society. Stratification occurs based on class, gender, age, religious affiliation and so on. Stratification is structured inequalities between different groups of people. All stratified systems share three basic characteristics. 1. The rankings apply to social categories of people who share a common characteristic without necessarily interacting or identifying with one another. 2. People's life experiences and opportunities depend heavily on how the social category is ranked. Being a male or a female, black or a white, upper class or working class makes a big difference in terms of your life chances. 3. The ranks of different social categories tend to change very slowly over a period of time. According to Kerbo, social stratification refers to a system with rather predictable rules behind the ranking of individuals and groups. The existence of systems of social stratification also implies some form of legitimation of the ranking of the people and unequal ranking. It is unlikely that a stratification system would remain stable over time. Class, caste and gender are such attributes of social stratification. Class is defined as a large-scale grouping of people who share common economic resources which strongly influence the type of lifestyle they are able to lead. Caste, on the other hand, is a social system in which one's position is given for a lifetime. In caste societies, therefore, all individuals must remain at a social level of their birth throughout their life. In caste system, intimate contact with members of the other caste is strongly discouraged, and such purity of a caste is often maintained by rules of endogamy, marriage between one's social group as required by custom or law. Gender, on the other hand, concerns the psychological, social and cultural differences between male and female. Gender is wrongly used as a synonym for sex. Sex is the biological and physiological differences between male and female. From above definitions, we realize that there is inequality in each of these social stratifications. These inequalities are in turn used as a base for discrimination. This can be exploitation, subordination or social exclusion. Forms of exploitation, subordination and exclusion. So, in what forms are caste, class and gender-based exploitation, subordination and exclusion manifested? To answer this question, in this section of the module, we will discuss three such manifestations. Poverty, gender roles, untouchability. Poverty. Anthony Giddens explained that sociologists and researchers have favored two different approaches to poverty: absolute and relative poverty. The concept of basic conditions that must be met in order to sustain a physically healthy existence. These conditions are sufficient food, shelter and clothing. The concept of relative poverty denotes as society develops, so understandings of relative poverty must change. As societies become more affluent, standards for relative poverty are gradually adjusted to upwards. These concepts serve policymakers to understand poverty so that suitable policies might be formulated to tackle poverty. It does not feed us with much understanding of exploitation. For that, we need to understand who the poor are. Giddens said the face of poverty is diverse and even changing, so it is difficult to present a profile of the poor. Some social groups are more likely to be poorer than the others, including children, older people, women and ethnic minority. In particular, people who are disadvantaged or discriminated against in other aspects of life have increased chance of being poor. The above concept of poor has a very important significance. There are certain people who are poorer than others and thus society is relatively fragmented. As we started this module, the question was, why are some social groups poor and others not so? Marxian understanding of class difference and alienation helped us in understanding these questions. French sociologist Bourdieu supported the idea that lifestyle choices are an important indicator of class. He argued that economic capital, which consists of material groups such as poverty, wealth and income, was important, but he argued that it only provided a partial understanding of class. Bourdieu's concept of social class is extremely broad and identifies four forms of capital that characterize class position, of which economic capital is only one. The others are cultural, social and symbolic. Hence, it is understood that classes are not based only on economy but also socio-cultural factors. Coming back to discussing poverty, economic capital is the base of identifying the rich and the poor. But exploitation is not merely based on economic capital. The exploitative relationship between the rich and the poor is also culturally and socially manifested. Hence, intersectionality will be our tool to understand this. For instance, a working class woman does not face discrimination only because she is poor and belongs to economically lower class. One of the factors here is lower strata in the economic scale and also her gender position. To make the scenario even more complicated, illiteracy, rural-urban divide also become factors which are closely related to poverty. It is observed that certain social groups do not have easy access to education, urban lifestyles, and much more that others have. Hence, the lack of an economic capital, social capital, cultural and symbolic capital makes the poor more susceptible to exploitation, subordination and exclusion. Gender roles. By the late 1970s, gender was a central concept for feminist research. Although the issue of sex in relation to gender remained contentious, feminist researchers differentiated between gender and sex, and the base for such distinction was that gender is culturally constructed and sex is biological. Judith Butler is not of the similar orientation of such feminist researchers. She, in her very important book Gender Trouble, argued that expressions of gendered identities illustrate that gender is performative. The cultural and biological distinctions of gender and sex was made on the grounds of identities and behavior. For example, men are supposed to be strong and women should be emotional. Men should not dress like a woman and behave like a man or behave like a woman, etc. Judith Butler, acknowledging the existence of such normativity, argued that there is no connection between gender and sex. Butler says that many feminists rejected the idea that gender is biologically or naturally fixed, but in doing so, they separated gender culture from sex biology, arguing that gender norms of behavior were built upon biologically determined male and female bodies. Butler rejects this position, arguing that there are no biologically determined identities lying behind the cultural expressions of gender. Instead, gender identities are established precisely through their continuous performances. There is simply no essential natural or biological basis to gender, even though the belief that there is such a basis is very widespread within many societies, and such beliefs shape people's behavior. Butler's position is that gender identity is not a question of who you are, but of what you do, and it is therefore follows that gender identity is much more fluid and unstable than was previously thought. Gender, as discussed earlier, is one of the attributes of social stratification. In the patriarchal societies, gender-based stratification denotes inferior status for women and femininity. Gender is a critical factor in structuring the types of opportunities and life chances faced by individuals and groups, and strongly influences the roles they play within social institutions from the household to the state. According to Connell, masculinities are the critical part of gender order and cannot be understood separate from it or from femininities which accompany them. Gender relations are the product of everyday interactions and practices. Connell sets forth three aspects which interact to form a society's gender order patterns of power relations between masculinities and femininities that are widespread throughout society, namely labor, power, and catechesis, personal and sexual relationship. Labor refers to sexual division of labor both within the home and in the labor market. Power operates through social relations such as authority, violence and ideology in institutions, the state and the military and domestic life. Catechesis concerns dynamics between intimate, emotional and personal relationships including marriage, sexuality and childbearing. Historically, the reproductive function in the body of women has been used as a reason for such an inferior position. Men's roles are generally more highly valued and rewarded than the woman's role. In almost every culture, women bear the responsibility for childcare and domestic work, while men have traditionally borne the responsibility for providing the family livelihood. The prevailing division of labor between the sexes has led to men and women assuming unequal positions in terms of power, prestige and wealth. This in turn has given way to various forms of exploitation. Going by the argument of Butler, the category of gender does not stop at the binary of men and women. Rather, this binary of men and women is normative. Any person who is not adhering to the binary norm of gender, for example transgender, is subject to exploitation, subordination and social exclusion. The reason for this is the fear of deviance in the social structure. One way of protecting the social structure is to protect and advocate gender norms. Rape, female infanticide, feticide, dowry death, sexual harassment, abuse in the workplace are all forms of gender-based exploitation, subordination and social exclusion. Untouchability. Purity and pollution are the main attributes of the caste system, which is the governing principle of untouchability. The world is self-explanatory. Untouchability means something not to be touched, but it is not as simple a phenomena. It is the politics of caste system to impose the notion of purity and pollution on the lower strata of the caste system. According to Dipankar-Gupta, the book view of the caste system is derived largely from sacred Hindu texts. Members of the upper caste find it extremely agreeable. It justifies caste system in terms of purity and pollution, giving the impression that all castes, high and low, abide by this single overarching textual hierarchy. The truth is that no caste, however so lowly placed it may be, accepts the reasons for its degradation. Harijans of whatever jati do not accept the upper caste view that the bodies are made of impure substances. It is quite another matter, argues Gupta, that other castes insist on treating them as polluting. Hence, caste system is not as simple as just merely a system of stratification that is hierarchical. It is a politics of power. Every caste uses the ideology of purity and pollution to maintain the ranks and the positions in caste hierarchy. Every caste wants some other caste below them. Gopal Guru states that according to Manusmriti, the physical association of the upper caste, which is still under the social influence of ritual orders with the earth, is considered to be ritually polluting. According to the text, the members of the top layer in social hierarchy are not supposed to soil their hands with either the earth or the mud. Using ritual pollution to assign negative quality to the earth goes completely against the Gandhian naturopathy, which treats the earth with much respect on account of its having healing value. Gandhi considered its healing as much as it helps in pumping out excess heat from the body. But Manu strictures deny this medicinal value of the earth. The earth thus suggests a broad division based on purity, pollution, thus dividing the top of twice born on the pure side and the Shudra and Atishudra on the impure side. Here Gure is addressing the question, how is purity and pollution institutionalized? As Dipankar Gupta argued, the sacred test of Hindu philosophy governs the idea of the caste system. Guru takes the idea of Panchabhut in Hindu philosophy, which constitutes all bodies. In such a system, untouchability was and still a form of exploitation which subordinates and excludes the low caste. Even though the law criminalizes untouchability, it is seen that in many places till date, it is still in practice. There are various research books, documentaries showing the reality of existence of such practices. Gopal Guru has been very vocal in the research and academic circles for this instance. The documentary India Untouched brought out groundbreaking oral narratives providing existence of the practice. In this module, we discuss three forms of exploitation, subordination and exclusion based on class, caste and gender. We also analyzed who perpetuated these and also why. When and why and how do exploitation, subordination and exclusion occur that are experienced, and the knowledge or ideological systems that legitimize and institutionalize it. In this module, as students of sociology, we understood the patterns of subordination, exploitation and social exclusion. We also developed conceptual categories of these three concepts. What is important for us to understand that these three concepts have to be looked as intersections, not as singular categories. Furthermore, using the examples in terms of practices of poverty, the examples in terms of the gender role, especially the whole idea about gender differences, and thirdly, in terms of understanding untouchability, we analyzed how the patterns of exploitation, subordination and social exclusion are integrated concepts within the complex reality that India faces. Thank you.